Hello friends, my name is Eric De Jesus, Global Power BI user leader, and today we're going to be looking at some of the highlights of the community. We are community, one of the oldest communities in the Power BI, and we count with 25 plus leader participation across the globe. We have presence in 20 countries, and we have Facebook and LinkedIn and some other social media that you guys can find our group in there. Right now we have 5,000 members on Facebook. Those members are active. We're trying to help people, like whatever they ask a question in there, we're trying to help them out in there. So today Anthony's going to be talking about data masking from SQL Server to Power BI. And this session details are like the Power BI is a great platform that enables self BI service, and however, this sensitive data can be challenging due to the recent abuse. Today in this session, Anthony is going to be guiding us on some of the capabilities that end users can apply on this one. Anthony is a data platform MVP, also Power BI user group leader for the Victoria, BC in Canada, and also have been presenting in Build 2017 and the Power BI Tour 2017. And he is a lead development and award-winning AI solution, so also looking into the AI solution. And today, Anthony is going to be guiding us in this fantastic dynamic data masking from SQL Server into Power BI. The way that you guys can connect with us through Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, as I mentioned before, and also we have our community size into the pod community. And if you guys have any question, want to present for this community, just please reach out to Vishal Pawar or myself, Eric De Jesus. We are here to help. So right now I'm going to hand it over to Anthony so he can continue with the presentation. Thank you, Anthony.
All right, thank you, Eric. Let me share my screen here. All right, so as mentioned, today we're going to be talking about dynamic data masking and essentially leveraging that feature within SQL Server and having that bubble up to Power BI so that you can secure your data and obfuscate it. So in terms of agenda, I just wanted to do some introductions, and then I have a couple of quick slides that kind of will set the context. So explain, how this feature works, how to use it, what it's required. Then I'll do a demo, and then I'll just do a recap and open up the floor to questions and answers. So yeah, a bit about me. I'm a data platform MVP, and as you can see in my picture there, I'm a father of two, about to be a father of 2.5 as we're getting a puppy soon. The kids have finally convinced me it's time to get a dog, so that's the excitement of my family talk these days. And I've been working in BI and machine learning and AI projects for over 12 years, both public and private sector. I run a Power BI user group in Victoria, in BC, Canada here, and I'm also a member of the following Microsoft advisory groups. So yeah, as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about redacting sensitive data. And this is very useful for situations where you need to enable users to use the data to build reports and analyze, but you might not want them to see all of the details. You need to, mask it for certain individuals. And it used to be that this, masking the data was almost a project in and of itself, because you would have to establish all the rules, right, test it out, develop code. And as of 2016, in SQL Server 2016 and later, this is an out-of-the-box feature that comes with SQL Server. And you can basically use simple transact SQL commands to apply these masks, and the data is masked basically on the fly. So it's not physically changed. It's anonymized as users are querying it. And it's really easy to apply, and it has a lot of great capabilities. So it can bubble, because this code resides within the database, it bubbles up inside, any reporting platform like Power BI or Excel or reporting services. And today I'm going to show you how you can leverage that and use this capability to make it easy to anonymize the data so that end users can still use it for quick reporting and analysis and creating dashboards, but not necessarily see all of the details. And there are 4 different masks that come with it. There's default, which basically applies whatever mask is appropriate depending on the data type. There's an email mask. Partial is for when you want to, for example, apply kind of a custom string mapping on top of that, and then random is for numeric to create random numbers. So how does it work? Well, basically it's an alter table, alter column SQL command, and then you specify what type of masking you want to apply with the function. So at the very end here, you can see we have the ability of saying, okay, apply the default function or the email function, the random or the partial. So it's very simple to go and apply this, and then you can specify and grant the unmask privilege to certain users, or basically once it's applied, any users who do not have administrative rights or the unmasked privilege will see masked data only. So, as I mentioned, this comes with SQL Server 2016 or later. It's also available with Azure SQL databases. And it comes out of the box with Enterprise Edition, Standard Edition, Web, Express, Express with Advanced Analytics. So across the board, you have this capability. It's out of the box, and it's really easy to use. So I think if anybody's in a situation where they have to redact or obfuscate sensitive data, look towards using this feature because you have it if you have 2016 or later. So now I'm going to jump into a demo. I'm just going to flip over to so I have a VM that I have running up here in Azure, and inside of it I have SQL Server 2016 Standard Edition. So I'll just show you that for a minute here. So you can see here it's Standard Edition 64-bit. And I've imported the Wide World Importers sample database. It's kind of the new one that replaces AdventureWorks. For those that are not familiar, anybody can go and grab this. So it's a great data set to go and work with for scenarios like this. And I have a bunch of different tables here. So, in my situation, imagine that I want users to be able to analyze, customer orders, but not necessarily see all the details on, who placed the order. Not everybody's allowed to see that, right? And we also might want to hide some details regarding, the unit price and the quantity ordered. So they can see the total amount, but not necessarily see all of the details. Well, thankfully, dynamic data masking essentially kind of comes to the rescue with this. So I'm just going to run a quick query here for a minute to let you see what this looks like. So I'm just going to run this query, and this will allow me to see which columns I have currently masked within the database. So as you can see, right now I do not have any masking applied. And the first thing I'm going to do is apply some masks here. So I'm going to add one mask to the employee name, and I'm going to use the partial function. So this will essentially hide all of the letters except for the first letter. So they'll still be able to see the person's the letter of the first name, but nothing else. And I'm also going to apply a couple of other masking functions here. So I'm going to apply one to the unit price. I'm going to use the basically mask it with a random number between 0.0 and 1.0. And I'm also going to do a mask on the quantity. And it's because this one is an integer, it's going to be between 0 and 1, and my unit price is a decimal, so I'm going to do it at random between 0.01 and 1.0. So I now have those 3 masks applied. So I'm going to flip over to another connection here. So I'm logged into the same box, but I'm using a different account now. I'm using Bob Jones, and I'm going to open up a Power BI report that's connected to that data source. So I'm going to show you what that looks like here. And that's just a warning because it's doing a direct query into that SQL Server data source. And I'm just going to close this out, cancel that. And so it's going and querying the data. And so you can see I have this is just a very simple direct query. I have my order dimension and my employee dimension and my order fact. And I'm creating a very simple table here that displays the employee's name, the quantity, unit price, and then the total values. So as you can see, because I have the mask applied now, the end user who's going and interacting with this data source, they cannot see the details regarding who made the order and how much and the unit price. One thing you'll notice though, for the quantity and unit price, it did not, and this is kind of a weird quirk within the, using the direct query in Power BI, that the random numbers did not get passed along into this. It's basically only showing zeros. So that's something to be aware of, is that, okay, when you're doing this, this behavior does not apply when you're using SSRS, for example. In SSRS, you will see a random numbers between 0 and 1 for quantity, and between 0.0 and 1.0 for unit price. So that's just something to be aware of, that when you're using this, you might get this unexpected behavior. Now I'll flip back to my SQL Server instance, and I'll show you again that I have that mask applied now. So I'll run this query. You can see I have those masks applied to those columns, those tables, what the masking function is. One thing that I would recommend that you do is, if you're going to start to use this masking capability, it would be good to make this data available to users so that when they're going and essentially doing data discovery, building their own reports and dashboards, they have a way of understanding, okay, which ones are masked or not. So you could easily go and include this into your Power BI report, or a better way would be to include it into your tabular model, which I'll get to next. So I'm just going to show you what it looks like if we go and remove this masking function. So I can go and ungrant the grant unmask to my user here. So I'm going to go and do that. And so now this user, Bob Jones, should be able to see the actual data. So I'll flip back to my Power BI report for a minute, and I'm going to hit refresh. And so you can see now I see all of the actual true data. Now, one thing to keep in mind too, it did aggregate, right? So because when I was applying the mask on the employee name, it was only showing you the first letter, and that's what I was using in this table here, right? So it was aggregating up and essentially, something to be aware of, that when you're using these masks, you may get some different aggregation results depending on how you're using it. So, again, I also keep in mind, if you wanted to look at data at the lowest grain, you might want to use something like the employee identifier, like the employee key or something like that, to make sure that you see all the details for every person. And as I mentioned, this is a direct data source. So So you can see I did a direct query into this local worldwide importers database. And because I'm doing a direct query, that's why I'm able to essentially use the dynamic data masking. An import will not work because an import will bring the data, copy the data out of the database into Power BI. And so what will happen is if you have a mask applied, it will redact the data as it's going and querying it, and then make a copy of it with the mask applied inside Power BI. So if you want to do dynamic data masking, you need to use a direct query. So I'll flip back to my SQL Server instance here, and I'm going to revoke that mask again, so applying it back on to this user. And I've done that now, and if I go back to here, you can refresh this, and we should now see that, again, we now have the mask applied, can't see the full employee name, quantity, or unit price, and we can see every employee if I add the employee key, for example, right? So you can see how I still have all the raw detailed data. I'm just seeing a mask on the employee quantity and unit price. So this is using Power BI and a direct query into that source database. It's really good for kind of, departmental or individual type solutions where you need to quickly go and get some data, maybe create some relationships. But you can also apply this same functionality for an enterprise semantic layer. So instead of using just Power BI, if you use something like analysis services, you have the same ability of leveraging dynamic data masking. And that's what I'm going to show you next. So I'll just flip back to my SQL Server instance here. And I'm going to open up my tabular model. So this is a tabular model based off of the same data source. You can see I have the same two tables. It's the same structure, the employee, the order. And the one key thing that you have to do with this model is under model properties, there is an option here. Maybe I'll make this a little bit easier to see, for direct query mode. Direct query mode is what you need to turn on in order for the connection that the user is using to Power BI. His credentials need to be passed into the database, and then the redacted information needs to come back through the tabular model. If you did not have this turned on, then when it goes and refreshes the tabular model, it would use whatever credentials are used to refresh it, and you would not get the redacted information. So this is a key step that you need to do in order to enable that functionality. Another key thing that you need to keep in mind with this is that for the model, for the connection to it, so if you open up this connection here and click on edit, there's an impersonation mode. This must be set to current user. If you don't set it to current user, it will not work. It'll use the service account, and the service account has has the unmasked privilege, or if it doesn't, it won't dynamically change. So this has to be set to current user, and I'll show you what that looks like if we don't set that for a minute. So I'm just going to connect to my tabular model instance here, because this is an easier way to kind of flip back and forth and change the connections. And so you can see here, for the one that's been deployed, I have the impersonation set to current user, right? So use the credentials of the current user. And then when I go into Power BI, so I'll close out my one with direct query. I'm going to save that. And now I'm going to open up my Power BI report that's using a live connection to the tabular model. And I'll close that out for a minute. And close that. And as you can see, I'm getting the same results as I had with my Power Query with a direct query to SQL Server. So with this one, though, as I mentioned, it's making a live connection to a tabular instance. You can also see I don't have the ability to modify relationships or the data in any way, but I have the same results where basically the employee name, quantity, and unit price are hidden. And if I include like the employee key, you can see that I have all of the details for all of the employees. So I have all of the granular details. I just do not have the ability to see who or how much was ordered by these individuals. And as I mentioned, a key thing to make this work properly is setting this. There's two things. First, you have to set it to direct query. So within the model, within that property, you have to set this direct query mode to on. And then the other thing you have to do is make sure that the connection, the impersonation, is set to use credentials of the current user. If I change this to use the service account, I'll show you what that looks like for a minute. And I'll click OK. So now my model is using the service account and using a direct query. And if I go back to my Power BI report and hit refresh, so this is a live connection to tabular, and tabular has a direct query to the database. So if I hit the refresh here, you see I get all of none of the information has been masked, so I can see all of the data. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Even though I have dynamic masking turned on, and I can see I still have that turning on if I run this query here. So I still have dynamic data masking turned on, and the user does not have the unmaskability. But because the model is using the service account rather than the current user, it's unmasking. So let's switch that back now to using the credentials of the current user. OK. And then I'll go back into my Power BI report and hit refresh. And you can see now that the employee, the fields that I masked have been applied. So it's a very powerful way to, and this will change basically on whatever user I'm logged into. So if I were to access, I have the masking applied right now with this Bob Jones user, but if I were to go and run this same report using a privileged user, so I'll go to my live connection, exactly the same report. And you see with this privileged user, I have access to all of the data because this user has the unmasked privilege, so they see it. And this is through the tabular model. Same thing applies for the Power BI report that's using a direct query. So it's a very powerful way to hide the data and to restrict who can see what and what details are available to them. And as I mentioned, this query is very valuable to have. And so one recommendation that I would have is that in your tabular model, so in this model here, adding that as part of your model. So you can go and bring in a new data set from that, and then go and leverage that to so if we go and bring that in, and I'm just going to build this and redeploy it. So now I have this list of essentially all the columns that have been masked within my data source as part of my semantic layer, as part of my enterprise-wide semantic layer, my tabular model. And I can go and deploy this. And then I can go and leverage that inside of here. So now you can see I have a new data set here, and I can basically drop this into my report and see, okay, well, I don't know why this is not working. Try that again. But essentially, this gives me the ability to integrate that insight into what is being masked and what's being masked, and allowing users to go and then base their decisions on kind of informed behavior. Because the reason why you want to do that is when the masking is applied, let me jump to the other one. When the masking is applied, for example, on these quantity, these numeric fields, right, this could be a valid result, having 0 quantity and 0 unit price. So if you add that insight into this report, then at least the users will have that understanding that, okay, yeah, these values are 0 because a mask has been applied to it. So it's, again, a very powerful way of leveraging that insight and that capability. So that is it for the demo portion of it. Were there any questions before I flip back to the slide deck? All right, I will go back to slide deck. So just to kind of recap what I just talked about and what I showed today. So within SQL Server 2016, I applied a mask to the employee dimension, to the employee name. I used the partial mask, which allows me to kind of customize what type of mask is applied. So I can essentially expose or hide certain, essentially apply a pattern to the string to mask the data as I see fit. So I used, I showed the first letter of the person's name followed by a whole bunch of X's all the way to the end. But you could have showed $ or whatever combination you want. And then I also applied a mask to the unit price. That was just a random integer mask from 0.0 to 1.0, and of course the one thing to keep in mind is that in Power BI, basically the Vertipack engine that is underlying the Power BI model system, as well as the tabular model, it doesn't bring that across smoothly, so you have to be aware of that when you're using this functionality. And I also applied a mask to the quantity, again using the same thing. And then, after I applied those masks to those fields and those tables using SQL Server, then in Power BI, I established a direct query to that SQL Server database and brought those tables in. And then you could see when I logged in with a different user how the data was obfuscated and hidden, basically, from that user's view. And then I also did a very similar thing with SSAS, tabular, so analysis services. I established a model, same 2 tables, again with a direct query, but the thing to keep in mind is that the impersonation must be set to current user, cannot be set to the service account. And one other caveat with the direct query, in order to use direct query with SSAS Tabular, you must have the Enterprise Edition or the Developer Edition. So you can't use Standard Edition or the Express Edition to enable the direct query. So you have to have that with your Analysis Services Tabular instance. And then I established a Power BI live connection to that tabular model. So essentially, Power BI was querying the tabular model, and then the tabular model was doing a direct query to the database, pulling back the data and on the fly masking it based on who was trying to read it, essentially. So, the reasons why this functionality is so useful and beneficial is it's done at the source. So the data masking is done inside SQL Server, regardless of what tool you use. So I could have used, reporting services. I could have used Excel. Doesn't really matter. It's all done within the database, and it masks it on the fly based on who you are. It's very easy to implement. As you can see, it's just a couple of alter table, alter column statements, and you can grant and revoke privileges on the user to give them the ability to see mass data or not see it. As I mentioned before, it's on the fly, so it doesn't physically change the data in the database, which is also hugely beneficial. And it's flexible, right? So you can essentially define who can and cannot see the real-world data, and you can do that using Windows credential or also SQL Server login. So if you have the ability to use both, it will respect both. It's basically tied to the login that is specified within the SQL Server instance. There are some limitations and restrictions that you should be aware of. So, that you can't use it with always encrypted. So always encrypted was a hero feature that came out with 2016, same time as the data masking, and basically always encrypted overrides dynamic data masking. It kind of makes sense, right? Why would you apply dynamic data masking if everything is everything is encrypted, if always encrypted is on, right? It also won't work with the file stream or the column set. And actually, one thing I should mention too before we even dive into this is that data masking, it does not replace security, right? So you still, if you are working with sensitive data or classified data, you should always apply proper security because it is possible to bypass it, right? It's complicated to do that, but and so the kind of typical situation you use dynamic data masking is for internal, where you have an internal data set that users are allowed to use, but they might not be allowed to see all of the details. They can see most of it. That's kind of a scenario where you'd use dynamic data masking. If it was any kind of classified or highly sensitive information, you still need to use proper security, row-level security, right? Possibly encryption, and you can, always add to that mix with dynamic data masking if required, but it does not replace it. Yeah, and so if you need more information, all of these details come from that link down below. And that is basically it. Are there any questions? All right. Well, I guess stay in touch. I work for CR Systems. My name is Anthony Bulk. I'm also on Twitter and LinkedIn. Yeah, so feel free to contact me anytime. And if there's anything else you wanted me to review or go in more depth, let me know. But yeah, thank you.